Hello everyone. My name is Maya Kraus. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a student at Northeastern studying environmental science.
And my name is Ella Moranis, and I use she, her pronouns as well, and I'm a high school senior at the Bremer and May School.
Yeah, so we are going to give a presentation on an incomplete history of U.S. labor strikes and environmental protests. So here's our agenda. We're going to start by talking about why are we talking about both of these movements at the same time. Then we're going to give a little bit of origins to striking and the labor movement. Then we'll move to how violence has been involved in the labor movement and how the federal government has gotten involved. And then we'll talk about some examples of labor strikes. And we'll take a quick stretch break to get up and move around if you're able. And then we'll move into the environmental movement. So what led up to the first Earth Day in 1970. And then we'll discuss the first Earth Day and what were the outcomes of that and what were the failings of the first Earth Day. And then we'll talk about some environmental protests since then. Then we have about 20 minutes of some action steps that you can take. And then we'll have about an hour of a panel where we'll have a labor organizer and a climate organizer discussing how we can bring the movements together and how coronavirus has affected their movements. So I just want to give a quick disclaimer that this is not meant to be a comprehensive history of either of these movements, since we only have an hour to present to you about the movements. That's in no way going to cover every aspect of all of the movements that we're discussing, but hopefully this will give you a good background of some of the key moments in the labor movement and the environmental movement.
And so just really quickly, recently groups who have been using video conference services have had their calls interrupted by trolls. So these trolls, which are often political opponents trying to get in the way of our progress, sometimes interrupt meetings in subtle ways and sometimes in shocking and disturbing ways. If that happens, we have moderators who are prepared to remove these people as soon as possible. They may interrupt as a group or as individuals. If many interrupt at once, you can protect yourself before we have a chance to move all of them by turning the volume down and kind of closing your computer screen a little bit. But in movement building, we always face the risk of infiltrators and opponents who want to harm us. And when that happens, we need to take care of each other and stay focused on our vision for a better future.
Yeah, thanks, Ella. So something we want to encourage you to do when we're presenting is we know this is kind of at least the first half of our presentation is a lot of information, and it's a lot of us talking at you about different historical moments, which can be a bit draining. So we encourage you to ask us any questions you have using the Q&A tool. And additionally, can you do this? Is there a chat?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so but a lot of the point of our presentation is to show how we can connect history to present day. So if something we talk about relates to something that's happening now, we want to encourage you to put a star or a plus in the chat. Yeah. So why are we talking about the labor movement and the climate movement together? So there's three main reasons that these movements are connected. First of all, we're using the same tactics. So we're using the power of many to leverage our collective ability to stop business as usual by halting production, stopping work, skipping school, blocking streets. And secondly, a lot of the times we are fighting for the same thing. We're fighting for safer conditions, whether that be working conditions or environmental conditions or economic conditions or all three. And thirdly, coronavirus and the current pandemic ties both of these movements together because the pandemic has disproportionately affected the working class and people of color, who are also the groups that are most disproportionately affected by environmental injustice. For example, people with chronic respiratory diseases are more at risk for coronavirus, and those are people who are also the diseases that such as asthma or chronic respiratory illnesses are connected to people who live in locations with high levels of pollution. So there is a big connection between these movements.
So just to take a little bit to talk about the origin of striking. So when the Industrial Revolution kind of came into full swing and there was a higher need for mass labor, the transition from family businesses and smaller businesses to factories with hundreds of employees was super fast and really abrupt, and often happened without any consideration of policy. So there was a lot of increased demand and a quick transition to high supply. Individuals couldn't really air their grievances to bosses at the time because they were such a small cog in the machine of the workplace. So it always took mass movement to initiate change. But strikes were made illegal soon after they became popular because, like I said, there was not a lot of consideration of policies that would protect workers, and bosses could basically do whatever they want. So there were very few regulations put in place to protect the workers advocating for their workplace rights. But the word strike actually comes from sailors in 1768 in London. So they weren't being paid enough to work on trade ships. So they struck the sails and refused to put them back up until they got what they demanded, which rendered the ships immobile until they got their way. When the word spread about this tactic, we adopted the phrase, and now that's how we talk about strikes. So the power of labor strikes is often demonstrated in how they resulted in violence incited by the US Army. So between 1877 and 1900, the acting US president of the time called in the army to break up to 11 strikes, and governors called in the National Guard on between 118 and 160 occasions. And obviously countless other times mayors called police on occasions to preserve public order during strikes, sit-ins, or protests. But the frustrating thing about this is that the militia that was being called in to deal with the strikes was usually directly funded and supplied by the corporation heads who were calling them in. So this practice is at some times still used today, especially through the hiring of private militia, which was the case at the Dakota Access Pipeline, where private investigators and militia were sent in to police the organizers. But back to the strikes. These companies would try to mollify the workers by offering insurance contracts that didn't really insure them against anything, just to kind of get them to calm down and kind of mollify them, like I said. So as we wonder how we will ever overcome the forces that are in today's oppressive systems, we look to numerous stories from history of the truly inspiring unity of the people against all odds. So the textile mill strikes are often recognized as some of the first industrial strikes to ever happen. They represent young immigrant women organizing against employers who profited immensely from the dangerous and taxing work that they did daily. This strike pulls together worker safety and labor regulations, both of which are at play today in the current pandemic. So there were a series of strikes throughout the entire 19th and early 20th century in Lowell, Lawrence, Exeter, Manchester, Pawtucket, and other New England towns. So most of the workers in these mills were young women and children, and they were usually those striking against the injustices in the workplace. So they hired women and from the ages of 11 to 35. And most of these places required a 48-hour work week in incredibly dangerous conditions with very little pay and like very minimal worker protections. So the original strike was initiated when the wages were lowered by 20% in cotton mills, which caused a general outcry. But at the same time, some of the mills raised their hours to up to 54 hours per week, which combined with the low rate wages sparked a rebellion. Unions from each state got involved, but cooperation was scarce and there was a general air of disorganization. Many workers didn't belong to the unions and it was hard to organize at the time. In Massachusetts, over 10,000 workers went on strike. So the wages were being lowered to accommodate transportation fees, bringing raw materials in from other parts of the country, but they were already making next to nothing. And most of these workers were only working to supplement the income that their fathers and brothers were making. So this was like a very necessary part of family income. And a lot of them were immigrant women and hadn't been in the US for that long and didn't have protections from the government or from their employers. And so the other risky part about their work was how high of a risk it was for their health and safety. So textile mills posed a high risk of respiratory disease, especially because of the dust and the lint in the air. And the machinery was incredibly dangerous. Accidents would happen all the time, and the company was rarely obligated to compensate the injured worker. The timeline of the strikes spans from the early 19th century to the early 20th century, and while wage increases and work week length decreases were eventually achieved, it wasn't until around 1913 that these changes were enforced. And during the strikes, corporations were able to ignore the striking workers and simply bring in new workers to replace those on strike, starving the strikers out until they had to return to work to continue making money to support their family. After years of fighting, the textile worker unions were also eventually recognized, but there were like generations of women fighting for workplace rights without avail. And they were striking for a safe workplace and health protections, which is super similar to the workers right now during the COVID crisis. But this action also emphasizes the power that young people have. They can be leaders and in fact have to, as much as adults when their livelihood and health is at stake.
Cool. So another early and monumental labor strike was the Pullman Strike of 1894. This strike is known for using the power of solidarity across regions and employers to support their struggling fellow workers, as well as for the origins of the Labor Day holiday. And it's also the strike that made Eugene Debs famous. So the Pullman Company, which was owned by George Pullman, manufactured and operated first-class railroad cars that traveled across the entire country. Most of the employees lived in the company town, which was near Chicago, where the Pullman Company, so their employer, owned the homes and the stores. So nearly all of the wages that these workers were making from the company went back into the company hands. In 1893, there was a severe economic depression in the United States, and Pullman cut wages by 30% and laid off hundreds of employees while not changing the cost of housing and food in the town. And this turned the Pullman workers to unite in protest to demand changes. So the railroad workers joined the American Railway Union, which was led by Eugene Debs at the time. And though Debs tried to convince the other members of the union to allow the black workers entry, they were excluded from the railway union. So the white Pullman railroad workers began to strike in May of 1894, and they appealed to their union for support. So starting in June, the American Railway Union decided to support the Pullman workers by having their members refuse to run trains that carried Pullman cars. And this effectively paralyzed trains that were running across the country. And this was pivotal in bringing national attention to their strike. However, many of the black workers who had been excluded from the union were hired by the Pullman Company to replace the striking workers. Additionally, because the trains that pulled the Pullman cars also pulled mail cars, the federal government intervened on June 30th, since obstruction of mail is a federal offense. And some of the striking workers became violent by burning train cars, and this was used as an excuse by the government to send in the National Guard, who would eventually kill more than 30 protesters. Interestingly enough, a few days before federal troops were sent in to control the protesters, President Cleveland made Labor Day a federal holiday because the Democratic Party needed to show that they were pro-labor, even as they were planning to break up this massive strike. So the strike was unsuccessful as it sort of fizzled out after Debs was arrested for his involvement in the strike. There are a lot of similarities between the Pullman strike and the environmental movement. If people want to put some in the chat, I also have written down a couple that I found really interesting. I think one takeaway from this is that when protesters involve violence, it really shows the desperation of people and what is at stake for them, but it can also change the tone of a strike, and it comes with consequences such as the government justifying bringing in armed forces. Additionally, the government will present an empty gesture such as creating a holiday while actively working to undermine our work, which we've seen in the environmental movement where politicians will say that they support our actions and they want the same things that we do, but they don't work to actually put those into action. Additionally, how do you see the chat? Okay, cool. Additionally, divisions across race cause conflicts that distract workers from who is really to blame for the problems they're experiencing. And the last thing I felt like was relevant is as this was happening at the time of an economic depression, and we are entering into one right now with coronavirus, we have already started to see more labor strikes for better wages and better working conditions for people, and this will only continue as the stay-at-home order is lifted and companies try to deny workers their wages or their right to their fair compensation. Another strike that captured public attention and brought issues of dangerous working conditions to the minds of Americans was the Memphis sanitation workers strike in 1968. Historically, in many southern cities, such as Memphis, low-wage, grueling jobs were reserved for Black laborers, and they were prevented from unionizing by racism within the unions, so similar to the Pullman strike. The mayor of Memphis at the time, Henry Loeb, refused to take rundown sanitation trucks out of service or pay city workers overtime, and wages were so low that most of the Black sanitation workers were on welfare and relied on food stamps. Additionally, the Black sanitation workers did not have uniforms or access to the showers, as that was reserved for the white drivers, so they were forced to walk home in any conditions because they would smell so bad from working in the sanitation, and they had no way to clean themselves in order to get onto public transportation. On February 1st of 1968, two Memphis sanitation workers, Eckel Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed to death by a malfunctioning garbage truck as they were sitting in the back to avoid a rainstorm. And the compensation that their families received from the city was not even enough to cover their funerals. So this really brought to the public attention and to the forefront of the movement the injustices and lack of compensation and lack of respect that the workers had been experiencing. So 11 days later, 1,300 Memphis sanitation workers walked off of their jobs, demanding recognition of their union, better safety standards, and a decent wage. And about a month later, by the beginning of March, many civil rights leaders had come to support the strike, including Martin Luther King Jr. And on March 28th, the striking workers formed a massive protest that included civil rights leaders like Dr. King and 22,000 students. During the strike, a group of young men broke away from the group and they turned violent, and the police came in with tear gas, eventually arresting over 250 people and killing a 16-year-old. Dr. King gave his last speech ever to the striking sanitation workers, his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, a few days after this strike on April 3rd, 1968. He was assassinated in Memphis on April 4th. A few days after his assassination, an estimated 42,000 people that were led by King's widow, Coretta Scott King, and union leaders silently marched through Memphis in honor of Dr. King and demanded that the mayor give in to the union's request. The Memphis sanitation workers were successful in their strike. The city eventually recognized the union and guaranteed a better wage and working conditions, such as showers and uniforms, although the union had to threaten to strike again in order for the city to follow through on their demands. A few things that I took away from learning about this strike was how much racism contributed to the mistreatment of the Black sanitation workers, both through their experience as being lower than the white drivers of the truck. So even within the sanitation department, the racism that these workers experienced, as well as the white-only showers and facilities that they weren't allowed to use. It's also interesting to consider how connected the civil rights movement was and still is to the labor movement, as the sanitation workers' strike was both a strike for better labor conditions, but also a strike for racial equality. So what can the environmental movement learn from the Memphis sanitation workers' strike? Something that I took away from this was that just as student strikes are made more powerful by workers joining our movement, labor strikes have been made more powerful by students joining the movement. And often both movements are working towards the same goals of a healthy and safe environment for working and living. Additionally, workplace discrimination and environmental discrimination are interconnected, as they result in increased health and safety concerns for people of color and fuel the oppression of Black communities. If you want to learn more, Henry has added a documentary if people are interested in learning more about the Memphis sanitation workers. Okay, so that was a lot of us talking at you. We're going to give a couple minutes to take a stretch break, stand up. I don't know, Ella, did you want to lead a stretch?
Yeah, okay. This is my favorite little activity to do. So I don't know what it's called except for the 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Super fun. So if you can stand up, you're going to need a little bit of space. Okay, I'm going to stand up. Okay, so you're going to use all 4 limbs here, and you're going to shake it out 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 with one hand, and then you're going to go 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 with the other hand. And then with your left foot, you can do 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then your right foot, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And here's where it gets tricky. And you go back to your right hand and you do 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 4, 3, 2, 1, 4, 3, 2, 1, 4, 3, 2, 1, 4, 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. And now we've been stretched out. Super fun. If we were in person, it's like super invigorating. Lots of energy.
Yay!
Back to Maya.
Okay, so now we've discussed a few examples of some prominent and relevant labor strikes in the United States. But now we're going to move to the history of the modern environmental movement and what modern day activists can learn from the past 50 years of environmental and climate organizing. So before the 1960s, much of environmentalism was focused on conserving land and animals, such as the formation of national parks, the formation of the Audubon Society and the Sierra Club. But in 1945, the USDA began aerial spraying public and private lands with DDT, which is a powerful pesticide, and they were spraying this to kill fire ants. This inspired Rachel Carson. Oh, actually, hang on. In 1958, Rachel Carson, who was an author who wrote about nature, she was already relatively famous at this point. But she received a letter from a friend that inspired her to research and write a book called Silent Spring that was on the environmental effects of DDT. And this book was published in 1962, and it alarmed readers to the harmful effects of DDT on the environment and human health. And it led Americans to begin to think of the need to regulate industry in order to protect the environment. So this really transitioned the environmental movement from solely about the protection of land to the regulation of industry, which brought us to the modern environmentalism that we know today. However, she faced intense scrutiny, especially from corporate leaders and politicians, who accused her of being a communist for going against the US government. And I put this quote on the slide, so I felt like this really related to some of the things we've been experiencing today. So it says, Miss Rachel Carson's reference to the selfishness of insecticide manufacturers probably reflects her communist sympathies, like a lot of our writers these days. We cannot live without birds, or we can live without birds and animals, but as the current market slump shows, we cannot live without business. As for insects, isn't it just like a woman to be scared to death of a few little bugs? As long as we have the H-bomb, everything will be okay. So, you know, we can't live without business. Despite the scrutiny that she experienced, her book became incredibly popular, and it was even published in the New Yorker as, oh gosh, I can't remember what the word is for it, but where they would publish like a section of it each time an issue was published. And this led President Kennedy to have his administration research her claims, which were proven true, and led the US to ban DDT in 1972. So Silent Spring directly led to an increased awareness of environmentalism as we know it today, and the first Earth Day protest. So the first Earth Day protest idea was developed by Gaylord Nelson, who is a Democratic US Senator from Wisconsin. And he came up with the idea for a national teach-in on the environment to force environmental protections onto the national political agenda. This was inspired by the anti-war protests, the anti-Vietnam War protests, as well as the civil rights movement, who had done similar actions. April 22nd was selected because it fell in between spring break and finals. So this was a movement that was directed at students. On April 22nd, 1970, 20 million Americans took to the streets to demand a healthy, sustainable environment. This was about 10% of the US population at the time. And it brought together many groups that had been fighting against different environmental problems, such as oil spills, protection of land, etc. And Earth Day directly led to the creation of many critical laws and agencies that were devoted to protecting the environment, such as the Clean Air Act, Water Quality Act, Endangered Species Act, and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. So this was all happening in the early 1970s. Despite the progress in civil rights and economic equality that occurred during the 1960s, Earth Day 1970 and the laws that followed were flawed in their exclusion of the environmental issues that faced and still face communities of color. And this led to what is now known as the environmental justice movement in the 1980s. There were three main criticisms of Earth Day and the environmentalism that occurred in the 1970s. First is that the laws did not address how environmental harms and benefits are distributed inequitably. Second, the laws and movement in general were focused on protecting suburban environments, not urban environments. So they faced the same problem that the early environmental movement did, in that it wasn't addressing, it was thinking of environmentalism as separate from where most people lived, and especially where most people of color live. And a third criticism is that environmental activists focus too much on elite forms of advocacy, such as lawsuits and lobbying, and it doesn't engage the power of those who are disproportionately affected by environmental problems. Additionally, in the late 1970s, the Supreme Court established a standard that required those who had experienced discrimination from the government to prove that the discrimination was intentional, and that not that it was just an unequal distribution of burden. And this made it much harder to prove discriminatory actions. So we'll see an example of this coming up, where it will make more sense why this ruling was so harmful to the environmental justice movement. And since the environmental laws of the early 70s were not written with this in mind, it exacerbated environmental racism and made it much harder to challenge in court. So, the mistakes of not including environmental justice in the laws passed in the 1970s were easier to make because the legislators who were making the laws believed that the country was becoming more equal. However, this does not excuse the fact that the environmental movement has historically distanced itself from the issues of racial and economic justice.
I'm still muted. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Love Canal disaster, which is named for the man who kind of populated the area, whose last name was Love, but that does not reflect the outcome of the situation at all. So the Love Canal disaster was an ongoing environmental and social crisis in the 1970s and 80s after a covered-up toxic waste dump site began to leach chemicals to the environment in a small town in Niagara Falls, New York. So during the 1940s, Hooker Chemical Company, which is now known as Occidental Chemical Corporation, dumped up to 1,800 short tons of chemical waste, byproducts of the manufacturing of dyes, perfumes, and solvents for rubber and synthetic resin. After years of utilizing the area as a dump site, Hooker Chemical Company covered it with earth and just sold it back to the town for a total of $1. Unknowingly, the town built homes, schools, and housing projects on the top of the dump site and continued to live peacefully for about 20 years. But then on August 1st of 1978, the front page of the New York Times had the section in the black box on the screen. So 25 years after the Hooker Chemical Company stopped using the Love Canal as an industrial dump, 82 different compounds, 11 of them suspected carcinogens, have been percolating upward through the soil, their drum containers rotting and leaching their contents into the backyards and basements of 100 homes and a public school built on the banks of the canal. A few months later, the canal exploded. Plants began to die, waste disposal drums were leaking into the ground and were visible from the surface, chemicals coming up all over the town. People reported their children coming in from playing outside with burns on their faces and hands just from touching the ground. There was also a steep increase in birth defects and miscarriages in the area, as well as high white blood cell counts, which is now known to be a precursor to leukemia. So the state of New York offered to buy all of the houses affected by the chemicals. President Carter then authorized the use of federal emergency funds. For the first time, this was utilized in a situation where there wasn't a natural disaster. So Congress subsequently passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, the CERCLA Act, better known as the Superfund Act, which was involved in the removal of the remaining toxic waste in the area. But many unions and groups became involved in the Love Canal disaster, protesting the inequity of this situation and the discrimination against minority residents. This most likely had to do with the fact that the minority residents in Love Canal were more likely to rent and therefore weren't given the full representation as their mostly white homeowning counterparts. The initial organizing that took place in Love Canal was spearheaded by local residents Tom Heiser and Lois Gibbs. Lois Gibbs is generally a more recognized name, but it's usually overlooked in well-known research that the NAACP was involved in the legal proceedings following the expose of Love Canal and argued on behalf of the predominantly Black renters whose interests were perceived to conflict with the mostly white homeowner community. So the segregation in Love Canal was geographic and social, and the protests following the disaster at Love Canal are now known to be female-dominated, which many consider a turning point in women's leadership. But the prominence of white women's voices, like Lois Gibbs, tended to drown out the voices of the Black women and families, most of whom who lived in the federal housing project as renters and weren't as well represented. White workers protesting for safe relocation often left out their Black neighbors when advocating for the rights of the townspeople, and those on welfare with confusing punitive loopholes meant to keep them in poverty made it even harder for them to relocate safely. But in 2004, federal officials claimed that the cleanup was finished and the area was removed from the Superfund list. And the process cost almost $400 million and 950 families were evacuated.
So in response to the Love Canal disaster, the EPA and President Carter started cracking down on sites with toxic materials, including PCBs, which are used in electronics to cool the equipment. And in response to this, a chemical company in North Carolina decided that in order to avoid the legal repercussions that would come from the involvement of the federal government in toxic waste sites, they sprayed oil containing PCBs along the side of roads all over North Carolina. And it was like 30,000 gallons of oil. So the company was fined, and the members of the people who sprayed the oil were eventually jailed, but the federal government had to decide what they were going to do with all this contaminated soil. So Afton, which is in Warren County, North Carolina, was selected to host the hazardous waste landfill that would take the toxic soil. And Warren County is a small, predominantly African American community, which is one of the poorest counties in the state. In 1989, a public hearing was held to determine whether they should put the landfill in the community. And more than 800 people came to protest the placement of the landfill in their community, which I don't know how many of you have been to public hearings, but that's a lot of people. That was about 5% of the total population of the entire county at the time. The residents were protesting because they were worried the toxic waste landfill would pollute the water and deter local investment in their community. They suggested that the EPA put the waste in an already existing toxic landfill in Alabama, but the EPA claimed it was too expensive to transport the soil. So community leaders, including the local branch of the NAACP, launched a lawsuit against the EPA and the dump in 1982. They eventually lost the lawsuit, which goes back to the Supreme Court ruling that I mentioned earlier. This was a quote that I pulled from the lawsuit. It said, when the judge decided to rule against the NAACP in the lawsuit, he said, "There is not one shred of evidence that race has at any time been a motivating factor for any decision taken by any official in this long saga." So going back to the Supreme Court ruling, it didn't matter that the landfill placement was an unequal distribution of burden on the Black residents. It was just argued that race was not a motivating factor in the placement of the landfill. So construction continued on the site. And the residents staged a massive protest where they marched, held signs, and laid in the road to block the trucks from bringing the soil into their community. I think we have time. I wanted to show this video that I found. It was a news clip. Let me make sure my audio is connected now. Okay, this should work. Actually, hang on.
We will not allow Warren County to become a dump site.
The State Highway Patrol began moving in on the marchers as they approached the entrance to the state landfill. The signs and chants of the protesters made clear their opposition to having the toxic chemical buried in their county.
I don't want this stuff thrown in my water.
We're marching because we do not want this to affect our future.
If you do not cease this unlawful act, you will be arrested.
The leaders of the protests said they would not move, and they were the first arrested. As they were being escorted away, the crowd moved in on the entrance. Many of the marchers then sat in the road, and the patrol began arresting them and placing them on a jail bus.
State officials said they had no choice but to make the arrests if they were going to move the people out of the way and get the trucks in here.
One protester jumped in front of the first truck and was quickly hustled away. In all, 10 trucks arrived for the first dumping. As they unloaded the PCB soil in the landfill, state and federal officials defended the decision to stop protesters and to store PCB here.
We were hoping that we were going to have, of course, just a protest, but you witnessed the fact that there was an attempt to obstruct, which we simply could not allow to continue.
We feel very confident that we built a facility that is going to work the way in which it was intended, and we intend to just carry this project out to its completion. And
state officials say they're determined to continue the operation until they get the job done. Brenda Summers, WBTV News, Warren County.
Okay, so hang on, let me get my notes back here. So more than 500 people were arrested over 6 weeks of protests. And while the protests didn't stop the landfill from being built, it did bring attention to environmental injustices. And the Warren County landfill protests are considered the first environmental justice protests in American history. They also led to the election of many local Black officials. They also led to the establishment of an executive order that directed the federal government to make environmental justice a part of the federal decision-making process. Though this was enacted by Bill Clinton in the 90s, so it took about 10 years for the federal government to do anything about this. 10 years after the protest, there was an emergency at the landfill, as nearly 1 million gallons of PCB-contaminated water threatened to break the liner and spill into the groundwater, just as the residents had predicted. And the landfill was eventually contaminated in the early 2000s, which cost the EPA $17 million, much more than it would have cost to transport the soil to an already existing landfill. So, that was very, I don't know, it's crazy to me to think that the issues that we're facing today have been going on for many, many years in the United States. Okay, Ella, did you want to do this one?
Yeah, so we wanted to ask you, wait, why is it echoing? Okay, so we're gonna ask people to go to the link on the slide, which I think we can pull up and put in the chat because I don't think it's like an actual link. So undocumented workers are among the most vulnerable following the pandemic and have not been afforded the same aid that other households were provided. This bill would provide state support for these households in addition to budgeting funds to support immigrant organizations. So we're going to ask to go to the link and find your state senator. And once you found their contact information, just give them a quick call following the script on the document. So you can go ahead and do that right now. Super important. And yeah.
it if everyone can put a plus in the chat when they've completed this. Sean is asking if we just call our senators. I think so.
I would assume so because it's a senator bill, so it's in the Senate. So yeah.
There you go. Thanks, Hawa. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for doing that. We have one more ask of you. Okay. So here's another link. We want to tell our state officials to decarcerate now. We're supporting Families for Justice with Healing, an organization that actively seeks decarceration, especially now with the health risks posed by the pandemic. Incarcerated officials are at high risk for exposure to COVID-19, where health and sanitary conditions are poor. The carceral system disproportionately imprisons the poor and Black and brown individuals. It is also extremely punitive to individuals with few resources. Many incarcerated officials have not actually been convicted of a crime, but are in prison purely because they are unable to afford bail. Scroll to Wednesday in this link and support this action. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for supporting our partner organizations and doing some action items on Earth Day today. So we are going to move on to the second half of our teach-in today. Oh, hang on. Which is talking about the modern movements of the modern labor movement and the modern environmental movement.
All right, Maya, do you want to go to the next slide? Okay. So given what we now know about the vast history of workers and neighbors coming together to challenge the decision makers at the top, it's evident that we are standing on the shoulders of giants. Even so, the CEOs and politicians continue with their war against the everyday people of this country, and their tactics have become more understated and strategic. They hire experts in union busting to send anti-union messages out to workers and bribe leaders to speak against collectivism. They pay off politicians to blame immigrants instead of greed for low wages. They find loopholes in labor laws to hire entire workforces as independent contractors instead of employees. They create grand marketing campaigns to shirk the blame of oil spills, drinking water pollution, and climate change. Sometimes their methods aren't subtle at all, and they mount armed forces against indigenous people, Black people, brown people. The entrenched racism and their ways of maintaining the class system distract us from the real enemy and imperil the lives of people of color. While we mourn what our society has become, we also find hope within the fact that we are still here fighting. These efforts by the wealthy few have amounted to only momentary stifling of the voices of the people. In fact, in the past few years, we've seen historic amounts of collective action for the greater good of society. There have been wildcat strikes where workers were breaking their contracts by striking, a risky but bold step to take. Teachers have been negotiating contracts to include not only for improvements in pay, but also for more resources and opportunities for their students and the neighborhoods their students live in. The Green New Deal has risen in popularity for bridging demands of working families and climate activists, and young people have been leading student strikes of millions of people, reigniting global conversation around the urgency of action on climate change. Now we're in a pandemic where the bleak reality of the state of our social safety nets has come to light, and many are realizing that corporations are not the benevolent actors that they have been misled into believing they were. 22 million workers have been laid off since the stay-at-home orders began. Essential businesses remain open, but managers have little guidance on how to prevent outbreaks in their workplaces. These conditions have led to 115 worker strikes across the country. Here in the Boston area, workers at GE in Lynn and Boston, the Market Basket Distribution Center in Andover, a nursing home in Littleton, and 14,000 carpenters and painters across the whole state are all walking out and striking. The demands of these workers include providing better safeguards from this disease, not laying off workers, switching to producing medical supplies, and mandating that certain construction be labeled as non-essential. Additionally, there have been organized rent strikes happening across Boston since rent was due on April 1st. The pressure of the rent strike and the advocacy of state leaders has led Baker to signing the bill banning evictions and foreclosures while the state of emergency is in place. These efforts may not all have the same amount of success, but they are certainly showing the anger and the need of the people in crisis can only be, and thus must be, demonstrated by collective action. COVID-19 is not the only crisis we can expect in the coming years, and so there are lessons we can learn from how we respond and rebuild in this time to be prepared for the continuing fight for a Green New Deal. So we're going to move on to our panel. So we have on the call with us today Henry DeGroot from the Boston Independent Drivers Guild, and Hawa, I don't want to mess up your last name.
Do you want me to say it?
Go ahead.
Oh, it's Awa Hamidou Tabay. That's my full name.
Thank you. Here from Boston Climate Strike to share with us their thoughts on how we take action both in this pandemic and in the future to protect our health, our planet, and our jobs. So thank you guys so much for being here. Do you mind introducing yourselves and your organizations and what you both do?
Howard, do you want to go first?
Yeah, that sounds cool. My name is Awa Hamidou Tabe. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm from Boston Climate Strike, and I serve as the policy lead on the policy team.
Awesome. So my name's Henry DeGroot. I grew up in Newton. I'm the executive director for the Boston Independent Drivers Guild, which is a union that we're growing of Uber and Lyft drivers. I'm a driver myself. And I actually started as a climate organizer in high school in Students for a Just and Stable Future, which I don't think is still around, but I know that some of y'all, or maybe some of the people involved in the organizations that you are now participating in, we're in that group. So it's a nice kind of full circle to come back here and be in the space that I started. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we have a couple questions set up for you guys, but if the conversation flows into a discussion, that's totally fine. But our first question is, so we spent the first half of this webinar learning about the history of strikes and collective action. What stood out to you in comparison to your organizing? And either of you guys can go ahead.
I mean, I think the issue of the way that the capitalist class uses race, gender, or whatever especially immigrant status, to divide and conquer is still absolutely like one of the main features of capitalism. With rideshare drivers, it's we think possibly something like 80% immigrant. There's a lot of, especially Arab speakers, but also Portuguese. And it's something that we definitely have to grapple with, because there's also a lot of racist drivers, and even within the minority communities, the groups don't always get along. So it's still something huge for us to overcome. And then it's also a male-dominated industry. So the concerns of women, especially in terms of safety of driving, are not necessarily being brought to the forefront.
Yeah, I think I relate to that as well. Like I think there's a lot of working class division. Like we have an understanding that like what has been able to sustain capitalism is working class division, because we're not a monolith and we have all these other like different identities that hasn't allowed us to fully come together as a group. But I think what got like my attention the most is like this comparison, especially for the environmental movement, of the white middle class elitist movement that focused on like stereotypical like protections of like parks and whatnot, while you had like working class Black and Indigenous people of color out there and that were like getting undermined by the movement. And we're seeing that parallel theme again in the environmental movement, which is like growing worrisome, because especially like as a working class Black organizer and like feeling guilty for being part of a white middle class movement, feeling like I'm not fighting for myself, not fighting for people like me if I'm fighting in a movement that focuses on the white and middle class. So I think that's what really got my attention in that presentation.
Thank you, guys. Maya, do you want to?
Sure, I can ask the next one. So when we talk about organizing mass strikes or other collective actions, many people don't know just how much goes into planning them. So how have you and your group overcome the challenges of uniting people across class, race, age, and language to build a strong people's movement?
Probably, I would say utilizing partnership and utilizing, like knowing that we're not the only organization that's fighting for this, and understanding that we're not the only group. Yeah, hold on, I'm gonna get this. Sorry. And I think understanding that we're not a monolith and that we like have intergenerational partners. I think that's how we've been trying to address that.
Yeah, I mean, that's not an easy question. I mean, these are monumental challenges that we're coming up to. I would just say that never undervalue the power of building personal relationships and interpersonal trust in a group. We're fortunate enough that we have a lot of even though we're a small group and we're trying to grow into a real union with a full contract, it's not like dominated by white men, that we do have good diversity. And I know that when times get more difficult, the fact that we have like a good bond of friendship makes it a lot easier to move forward. So.
Yeah, and I also think like sometimes, especially when we're organizing, like I think about how I got involved with organizing, especially in the climate justice movement. And I was a lot coincidental, because I don't think, like, I think the way we try to also address that is like intentional outreach, which is like a thing that we talk a lot in climate justice movement, and specifically in Boston climate strikes, but we're going to like actually intentionally outreach to the communities that are frontline and vulnerable, so we can have those people lead the movement. And I think we've continued to struggle within that as a movement. And if we continue to, we're feeding into the same system that like doesn't distribute opportunities equally. And like I'm seeing that in the climate justice movement, like the reason we're like a predominantly white and middle class movement is because these are the people that are offered the opportunities the most. So it's like redistributing the way we like, the same way we're calling out for like redistribution of wealth, it's like redistribution of opportunities, so that like it's not like white middle class people fighting for these communities, it's allowing these people to like have the space to fight for their own.
Yeah. Thank you guys. So in your own experience, how do you think you've seen the intersection between environmentalism and the labor movement?
Do you want to go first?
I mean, I have thoughts, but you can go first because I started first.
I mean, like I said, I was a climate justice organizer involved in like divestment and that kind of thing before I got into the labor movement. And I definitely appreciated like the I think it was the first or second slide talking about the overlap, but I think it goes much further deeper than just what was touched on, the interconnection between the two. And I think when we think about social justice and we think about fighting against capitalism and for socialism, there's it is really important to think about the central role of the working class, not because economic issues like issues on the job are more important or more exploitative than race, gender, sexuality, national oppression, etc. That's not what it is. The reason why it's central is, number one, because the majority of people are proletarians, work for their wages. They're not small business owners, they're not students, they're not even unemployed or retired. And number two, because working class people in their mode of economic existence, not based on their identity, but in the way that they function in society to produce commodities, have an incredible power to shut down production, to shut down society. So we saw like the Warren County protesters blocking the road. That protest was historic. It was a great first step for the environmental justice movement, but the only thing that they could do as community activists, or one tactic that they could do, is block the road. The workers driving the trucks, if they had struck, that would have been different because the trucks wouldn't have been coming in the first place. Or an example I like to use is like the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Those are two ports. 1/3 of U.S. imports coming through just those two ports, which are in the same neighborhood, basically. And there's several thousand workers that work there. If those several thousand workers decide that maybe they're against a war, or they want to support a climate strike, or against something like COVID related, they can shut down 1/3 of U.S. imports just by not going to work, just by standing outside the gates. So there's an incredible role that the working class has to play, and that another reason why the workers' movement is so central is because the working class is going to be the most committed to radical change, that you're not going to have the same potential of kind of this facilitation or equivocation of middle class people who maybe, their interests are going to be split between protecting their own privilege and reforming society. So as a middle-class person myself, like what I would call on people to do is give your loyalty away from your own class to the working class and try and support that. And so if we want to see the overthrow of capitalism, which is necessary to protect our environment, it's not like middle-class activists, students have a role to play, absolutely, but it's the working class, which is much larger than the middle class and the international working class, not just in the United States, that has a real role to play. So but on the other hand, the middle class or the student layer, which I think has a strong overlap with the climate movement, can also play a role at the forefront because students are thinking about these issues. They have more time. They're not going to work every day. They're not necessarily, they could be, but they may not be taking care of their family. And so they can serve as the organizers to build opportunities for other people to get involved. So it's really can be more symbiotic. But that was very theoretical, but I hope that touches on some important topics. Awa?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like what you're saying, like to put in like context, is that I think both movements are inherently like anti-capitalist. Like the intentions is to work away from the system, and like you can or disagree with me, because I think like there is like the frustration about like moving, whether like do we want radical change or do we want reformation within the system that exists. And I think that's what like both movements are grappling with. But I think the environmental movement has a harder time like understanding that, especially because it's like hard because it's mostly middle class. Like the movement that we're seeing that are given attention in the media are middle class people. And like there's also like this big complex of like nonprofit organizations, and like it's very complex. I'm just not going to throw shade here. But I think like we see that a lot. Sorry, whoops. I need to remember what the question was about, because I want to remind me what the question was about.
Between climate and the labor movement.
Oh, great. I think both, like the working class is the class that is the most disproportionately affected by like environmental degradation and like pollution. So like the environmental movement has to work in the interest of the working class if it wants to succeed at all. And I think we need to understand that like it can't be a one like issue movement. Like I think we've like focused on like specific things. And I think the first way we started to see that like intersection between the two movements are like our demand for a just transition, and understanding that if we're going to move to 100% renewable energy, we're going to have to address that like workers in the fossil fuel industry still have like a right to environmental justice and have to like not lose like their like rights as workers and their wages and whatnot that like our society, like that in the societal base that we have right now, they depend on. And I think like COVID-19 has been like what allowed us to like expand our demands into more, not being just focused on like explicitly like direct environmental justice things, but also understanding like talking about wages, talking about like rent strikes and whatnot. I think like we're suddenly slowly becoming like the anti-capitalist movement that like a lot of people at first don't want to admit. Like I hope like people understand like the Green New Deal is just the beginning for the environmental movement. It's not the end, and like the way it's going to be administered, making sure that it's not to accommodate like the capital system that we have, but it's to abolish it. And like those are my intentions when I support things like that. So yeah.
And I just want to add that there's a difference. You were talking about the kind of the different layers and different interests within the environmental movement. They exist within the labor movement as well. There's a huge difference between what the real interests of the international working class or even the American working class are and the organized labor movement and unions. So unions also can play a very progressive role, but they can also be incredibly reactionary. There's a lot of unions, especially in the building trades, but also, for example, in defense industries, they get pretty great pay and benefits by participating in the destruction of the environment or the military industrial complex. And I mean, if they're going to get more pay and benefits, more power to them. Of course, we all support workers getting their fair shake, but their interests are inextricably tied with the defense of capitalism. And we also have to remember, which is almost never talked about within the labor movement, is that as part of the Red Scare, there was a counter revolution in the labor movement that the establishment kicked out all the communists and progressives out of the labor movement beginning in 1949 and installed patriotic, pro-capitalist union leadership, and backed the right wing within the unions. And it's illegal still in many unions. You can't be a member if you're a communist, just like it's illegal to work for the state of California if you're a communist. So those aren't really upheld. But the point is that there's also a middle class or a labor aristocracy or a special privilege that many union workers have. Very few workers in the US are unionized, and compared to white collar workers or professors, you know, they're not in this incredible advantage, but compared to fast food workers, they are. And so part of, like, in order for the labor movement to play a progressive role, we have to call out the backwards thinking, conservatism, short-sightedness of the labor movement and its regressive leadership. And that is a movement that's going on. For example, the Mass Teachers Association has been conquered by a progressive rank and file caucus that is moving in a socialist direction. But there's still a ton of work to do, especially in the building trades, to push back against this divide and conquer within the labor movement itself.
Cannot read that question, so if someone wants to read out loud that question.
Yeah, so Anna asks, can we hear about the state of both of the movements? Like, how are the efforts to unionize Uber drivers going? What moves is BCS making during COVID?
Do you want to start?
Mike, could you repeat that? I'm so sorry, I did not properly hear that.
No, that's okay. Okay, so can we hear about the state of both of the movements? How are the efforts to unionize Uber drivers going, and what moves is BCS making during COVID?
I'd also like to add that if anyone has questions, can you put them in the chat if possible? And we can either read them to the panelists or the panelists can answer them directly. Thank you.
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like currently with the state. Sorry, are you gonna start or am I gonna start?
No, go ahead, please.
Oh, cool. I think in terms of the state of both movements, not state, but the state of like BCS, I think what we're trying to do right now is like in our demands, which I think is like also something that's really important. Like when we're striking, it's knowing like what we're striking behind. I wish that like that had been amplified like from the beginning, because I think like that's yet another like slowly becoming a failure of the environmental movement, is that like people just see a strike as students and that they forget that there's demands behind us. Like that's why politicians see us as like allies rather than like against what they stand for. Besides the point. So I think what we start to do now is integrate like specific like COVID-19 like legislation that that's in support of like in the interest of like workers that we support. And we've also like put like demands for squatters and rent strike demands that we've integrated, and we're like moving towards like trying to move away from electoral politics, which I think has been a struggle because like the environmental movement hasn't like sort of works like mentioned like in the presentation, like there's lobbying and whatnot, and it's like trying to like grapple with like wanting to make change but also like not wanting to work within the system. Yeah.
Okay, so how is the labor movement, first of all, like there is a big reform effort that's going, I would say very well, and I would say maybe 2 years ago, the labor movement hit rock bottom, and there's been a lot of strikes even before COVID, and with COVID, it's only going to escalate. So that's excellent. The Uber drivers, the rideshare union movement is doing very well as well. Last year we had kind of a first action, National Day of Action. You probably heard the Uber driver strike. I don't have confirmation, but I've heard it was the most covered strike in US history, even though it wasn't really a real strike, or it wasn't, there was probably pretty insignificant participation, but it was I mean, the narrative around rideshare 3 years ago or 5 years ago was very positive. Like, oh, this is the future. People are starting their own businesses as and making a lot of money. To, oh, this is, you know, the narrative now is exploitation of immigrant labor through like exploiting loophole. Not even a loophole. We have a great law in Massachusetts. It's just Maura Healey hasn't done her job to enforce it. And poverty wages. So that was a big step forward. And then from May to really January, the groups around the country went back and kind of developed internally. In January, we had an international conference where we founded an alliance with like 23 countries in England. So that was a big step forward, and the kind of national work has kind of grown out of that. And in Boston, specifically, like just in the last, like in March, we went from having 400 drivers on the list to 800. We were able to do an online rally with Senator Warren speaking, and also a rolling rally. And so that was like a good kind of, what's the right word? Like it was a turning point for our organization where we were able to go from a small group of drivers to, okay, we can bring in labor leaders and progressive leaders. We can actually organize drivers in real life. And there's I mean, it's going great because drivers are really suffering, because we didn't have access to unemployment and paid sick leave, which we should have under the law. I'm just going to read this other question. The history of labor strikes we showed the strategy of strikes was to disrupt production. It hurt the economy. It also showed that workers are giving up quite a lot, putting themselves at risk. How do student strikes fit into this typical notion of striking? Does it disrupt society in a way or show tremendous risk taking? So I'm actually writing a book about student strikes. And so this is a question that I've thought a lot about. It's a big difference. When you, like in Lawrence or Lowell, the Lowell Mill Girls strike, when you strike, and those factories, they didn't used to have access to a lot of outside finance, so they couldn't get a loan. They were pretty much operating on what they produced and sold. That's it. So you shut down their production for a day, and their finances are in really bad situation. You can bring them to their knees really quickly. Kind of a halfway point is in the public sector. If you're at a university and you shut down, like your teacher's assistants over in UC Santa Cruz, you strike and shut down grading, the regent or the dean, their paycheck is not being affected by it, but it's interfering with the way that the university can continue, and it's certainly disruptive, but it's not disrupting the profit motive. So you have to use other things like public support, criticizing them for racial exploitation or police brutality or other ways to undermine. So the student movement can definitely shut down universities, but they can't really threaten the profit motive, which is a great way to make somebody listen. But they can do a lot of other important stuff. For example, in the 60s, the student movement, and especially the anti-war movement, struck against the notion that all Americans support the war, that the war in Vietnam was a good idea. And so it really eroded the credibility. That was an important first step, but it was really the Vietnamese soldiers killing Americans, and also the American soldiers refusing to fight, that ended the Vietnam War. It wasn't the power of students, but it was a good first step. So students can begin a conversation. That's really important. And then students can, if you look at the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Party, it was the working class that shut down the factories and that shut down the country and the soldiers coming home. But who was organizing those workers? A lot of ex-students who were expelled from university, committed to the socialist movement, and then became professional revolutionaries and were writing the the demands and writing the leading instruction sessions of workers in theory, and doing all sorts of the technical work that goes on behind the scenes that as a worker working in a factory, you don't get qualified in. It doesn't mean you can't become that, but studying at university, reading and writing is a great way to qualify you to do that kind of intellectual labor that's necessary. So that's kind of where I see the role of students.
Cool. I think student striking, personally, because I've always thought about too, like what sacrifice do students make when we strike, because strikes are meant to like have like service sacrifices, which is also like why digital striking is like not as effective, because there's no personal sacrifice that's made when you're digital striking, because you're normally just like in front of a screen, which is like normally why like teach-ins and whatnot. But I think education, like personally to me, has always been like the cycle of how to get out of poverty. So to be striking against that and like move and like not being there on that day to like learn has sort of been like a personal sacrifice that I've had, because I think like normally when you're like when you're like poor and working class and whatnot, like you're taught that like if you like follow like the like guidebook of capitalism and like you study and you pursue a career and whatnot, like you'll eventually like become part of the ruling class, and like that's like the little myth as to like why everyone believes in capitalism and whatnot. And I think like when we're slowly like striking from school, we have this understanding that like we're not gonna like follow those guidelines that we're given, we're not gonna like follow the pathway of like building career and whatnot, and like understanding that like society like and our like identities aren't based on like how much we can produce and like who we are as workers. So I think that is like also an important aspect, and I think that's also like an important aspect to like teach specifically to people who are like working class and BIPOC that have been taught that like education centers their entire lives. So it is a personal sacrifice to them, I think. But in terms of like disrupting business, I think that depends on how many people we get to mobilize. And like the more you mobilize, the more you're able to have that impact and influence that Henry was talking about. So
You
Awesome.
talk
So we
more about
have,
the importance of personal sacrifice.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Can you talk more about the importance of personal sacrifice?
I think like because if you're not sacrificing for, okay, hold up, I want to phrase this correctly, because I also think that like when we've been like striking, we've been telling people that like if you don't participate in the strikes, that you're not fighting right for the movement. And I've like even seen that like when people do restable actions and being like, if you're not taking part in the restable action, like you don't have the same dedication. So like there's just like this proof of like how radical and how much you can give up. But I think personal sacrifice is about like giving up power and giving up privilege. And so like that's what we're doing when we're like giving ourselves one day away from education. I don't think that's been as effective because we have like specific days and we're like trying to get absences and whatnot because we're trying to like mobilize as many people. So like if you get absences and there's no consequences to like not showing up. But I think it's been a personal sacrifice to like specifically organize, because the intentions of like a strike is also to absorb people to organize. And when you organize, like the more you're starting to challenge like education and whatnot. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I mean, if you think about I mean, just a basic strike for more pay, like the capitalist doesn't care that you personally sacrifice that. It means a lot to you that you're not getting your money, that you're struggling at home. But if you're a leader and you make a personal sacrifice, you get, whatever it is, it means something to your coworkers. It means something to your fellow. It means something to the general public or to people who might be in between. And so I think that's what's really important about it, is you gain the moral legitimacy by saying, I'm not just committed to this, or I'm not just trying to do something to make this different, but I'm giving up something of myself to get there because I care about it that much.
thank you guys. We have one question from Ruben. I'm gonna unmute you and go ahead and ask your question to the panelists.
I'm having trouble unmuting.
Whoops, sorry, I had to rejoin because like my internet was playing for a second.
That's okay.
Ruben, do you still have a question?
Oh, maybe it's an accidental.
It's an accidental hand raise.
Totally
Alright.
okay.
So, Ella, do you want to ask our panelists another question?
Yeah, okay. So the Green New Deal is purported to be the answer to bringing together the often clashing needs of the labor and environmental movement. What do you think has to go in order, wait, sorry. What do you think has to go right in order for that to happen? What do we need to be cautious of?
Could you just repeat that question? I'm so sorry. Like
That's
that
okay. Don't even worry. Okay, so the Green New Deal is purported to be the answer to bringing together the often clashing needs of the labor and environmental movement. What do you think has to go right in order for that to happen? What do we need to be cautious of?
So start.
Yeah, sure. Oh, do you want me to start or do you want yourself to start?
It would be great if you started.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you said, do you want me to start? That's why I was just silent. I'm sorry. So I actually have been thinking a lot about this, and I think the New Deal is like the New Deal that Franklin Roosevelt introduced is like a good way to look at like how we want to avoid what the New Deal did, the Green New Deal. So making sure that we're not leaving behind like specifically like BIPOC, because I think what the New Deal like succeeded in doing was in like it's like ensuring that like capitalism remained and like furthering working class division by seeing like what it did succeed in and what it failed in. So like it left behind like BIPOC workers and it like focused on like white man. Like it was very like the people who like benefited from it was very divided, and that's how we like maintained the system of capitalism that we have today. But I also think what I would like the Green New Deal to also do to like connect those two movements is to start to talk about imperialism. And I think talking outside of just like the United States and being like US centric, and understanding that like we can't also support like European countries to like continue to do like settler colonialism and exploit resources in other nations. And I think that's what I've like been continually worried about, because I think we forget like the US is, we don't forget, but like I don't think the Green New Deal acknowledges enough like the United States role in like foreign policy and whatnot that allows for us to like exploit and like just dump waste in like other people's countries and whatnot. So I hope like the Green New Deal can include that or start that conversation, but I don't honestly think it has. But, yeah.
That's a good point. I mean, I like what you said about the pitfalls of the New Deal, where you had, for example, domestic workers and sharecroppers or agricultural laborers were not included, which there was actually a lot of white workers in that situation, but also many blacks, and probably a plurality or the majority of black workers were in those categories. So they were basically left out. And there's a whole long conversation we could have about the Jim Crow within the union movement. What always annoys me when Bernie Sanders talks about FDR or the Green New Deal is that FDR was a capitalist, and he did not want to pass these great pieces of legislation that he was forced to pass. He passed them because there was a mass movement, not just in the United States, but around the world, that workers were seizing power in countries in Europe and elsewhere. And that a bunch of rich people went to an island and were like, how do we not lose everything? And they realized that they needed to make some concessions. They needed to make ways to institutionalize the labor movement and other things in order to exert more control over them. And so in that sense, at least if we're going to win the Green New Deal like we won the New Deal, which maybe it will be different, but they weren't fighting for the New Deal. They were, or many elements of the labor movement were fighting for a whole fundamental overthrow of capitalism. And so the harder we push, without going so far as to be sectarian or just totally disconnected from society, but the harder we push the left and the further, the more that the middle will be forced to grant concessions. And so rather than trying to appease the middle, I'm not generally a fan of that. And it's really, I remember one conversation I had, I was at the State House for some labor thing, and I ran into some of the leaders of the Massachusetts building trades. And we were talking about environmentalists and the Green New Deal, because I was like, hey, like, you guys got to be on board with this. Like, it's going to be great for the building trades, like a lot of jobs, a lot of construction jobs. And I mean, first of all, the way that they talked about climate people was like so dismissive and disgusting. And I just brought up that, like, you know, we can't, it's not in the interest of the working class to be producing oil or whatever we're doing that's just destroying the environment. And they were like, well, you try telling a union worker who's you know, getting their paycheck from doing that it's not in their best interest. And so that is a real concern. But again, that goes back to we have to just mercilessly drive out the conservative leadership in the unions. There's no room for that, and that is not something that's easy. But we can't have friends like those when we have enemies like the Koch brothers or Saudi Arabia or Donald Trump. So we have to, I guess what would be a mistake would be to try and appease those groups and not put pressure on them and take the fight to them.
Yeah, I can second that. I think the environmental movement is struggling between, like, do we compromise with what we have, or do we demand for like revolutionary actions? And I think like that's probably the stage that we're at right now. And I'm like, sure, many people have many opinions, because I think like the reliance on like, because I think our reliance, like, I love the fact that we've started to build like momentum on the Green New Deal and passing that, but I hope that like people understand that like that's reform, that like that's not completely dismantling like the oppressive systems and like the institutional racism and white supremacy that like ties capitalism together and whatnot. And like it's gonna take like actual revolutionary action, like to admit, like to start saying words like socialism and communism, to like actually like own up to like the demands that we're asking for to like achieve what we want. So.
Absolutely.
All right,
Awesome.
so
Yeah, go ahead.
thanks, guys. This may be our last question, depending on time, but I think it's an important one to bring up, which is, how has the pandemic affected your causes?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, drivers are really struggling. A lot of drivers, because we're misclassified as independent contractors instead of as employees, we don't have access to any worker rights. So things like paid sick leave or unemployment, we weren't able to access. Luckily, because of the crisis, you know, new laws were passed. I was just able to file for unemployment 2 days ago, and I just got approved. But that could have happened a month ago if I had been a statutory employee. And so I get messages from drivers saying, you know, I wasn't driving, I'm immunocompromised, but the money's run out and I need to go back on the road. How do I stay safe? And I don't have anything, I don't have any masks to give them. I can't do anything for them. And so that's really hard. But at the same time, it's really laid bare and presented an opportunity for us to do what we were already trying to do, which is fight for reclassification. And so in that sense, it's been beneficial. It's kind of a catch-22, but we want to, make as big never let a good crisis go. I forget what the phrase is, but we should take advantage of the opportunities that it does open up for us to demonstrate how fucked up the system is, and not just for Uber drivers, but for all workers, how vulnerable we are, and how the government can just print trillions of dollars to bail out companies when the neoliberal, the corporate Democrats have been telling us for decades that we can't afford something basic like healthcare, or a Green New Deal. So it's really bullshit. I mean, it's just a matter of priorities, and that they don't want those things, not that we can't afford them.
Yeah. I think the pandemic has impacted a lot. I think first, the way we've organized, we've always depended on in-person strikes to kind of define, specifically Boston climate strikes, it's in our name that we've depended on in-person strikes to determine how we achieve influence over the system. And I think now our reliance on the electoral politics is diminishing more and more as we're seeing the way the pandemic is getting addressed. And I think mutual aid is one of the projects that has started to initiate in Boston climate strikes, in which we're starting to see how we can help organizers within our organization, but also outside, and also seeing how we can partner and help the pre-existing mutual aid organizations, rather than ourselves being hey, let's start a mutual aid initiative. Even mutual aid initiatives right now are overwhelmed, need more volunteers, and directing our organizers to that. Which shout out to the logistics team in Boston Climate Strikes that's organizing that. Besides the point. And I also think it's impacted the way that we see, I think we spent so much time striking that people forget what we're striking for. And right now, specifically on Earth Day, we're starting to be talking about what are we striking for. I think that was the first way, when we when we realized we can do an in-person strike, we had calls where we were why are we striking, and how can we communicate that message now without actually doing an in-person strike and mobilizing this mass amount of people that we were expecting on Earth Day, which is still crushing to think about. But and I also think that it's impacted the way, because we the sacrifice in us striking was that not going to school. The school has been changed into online learning. So that's also been an interesting take point, because exactly what are we sacrificing for saying that we're digitally striking, which is why I've kind of moved away from that term. And I've seen this as more of an education opportunity to further talk about what is it that we're doing and why are we doing it, rather than saying that we're digitally striking, because I personally don't see us making a sacrifice other than changing around the way that we're organizing. And yes, and I also think I've talked about that before, but integrating COVID-19 demands, which I starting to now talk about workers and stuff. I think if you look at our past demands, it was a lot focused on renewable energy and how to implement that. And of course we still have that, because an act repowering Massachusetts to 100% renewable energy is super important. But it's also we're starting to talk about decarceration and starting to move away from being that one issue movement that we're known as. And at least those are my intentions with the vision of how Boston Climate Strikes will continue growing in the future. So yeah.
Thank you guys so much. I think we might have to pass it over to the rally now.
I would say thanks for having me, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Such an important issue, and the only way that we are going to win workers' rights in the long term, or a sustainable Earth for all of us and for future generations, is through a fundamental overthrow of the establishment, of the billionaire class and the establishment politicians, and the institution of a society that works for people's needs, and that's called socialism. And looks like maybe we have time for one more question, but I could really use, if you want to get involved, I could definitely use volunteers, and if your school allows it for credit, we can do an internship organizing workers. So I just wanted to plug that. We can always use help if you want to get some hands-on experience and training. That'd be excellent. So maybe I can share that with the moderators and they can share that out.
Yeah, it looks like we've got some people interested. I was gonna say, I think my last question was going to be like, how can we, as both the panelists and the audience, get involved in your movement? So there you go, there's one answer. And I know, Hawa, you had sent me something you wanted me to share. Let me figure out how to do that again.
Yes. And also, if you want to get involved with Boston Climate Strikes, you can DM us on Instagram. You can go on our website, or you can talk to me even. I don't mind giving out my contacts. It's like, yeah.
There you go.
Yes. So Boston Climate Strike right now is doing a Twitter storm asking for Speaker DeLeo and Senate President Spilka to pass these two specific bills and act relative to environmental justice. And in another one, that's an act re-empowering Massachusetts to 100% renewable energy. And you can tweet this specifically out. And we're hoping to just continue that for Earth Week. So that is an action item that you can participate in during Earth Week.
Awesome. Should we give people a chance to do this right now? We've got, how much time do we have?
I mean, if there's time, but I don't know if there's time because it's 6:55.
Yeah, people can take a screenshot maybe of the content and keep using it throughout the week.
Awesome. Well, okay. So I thank all of you for joining us today, and we want to give a special shout out to Rachel Eccles for helping bring this all together and being a lot of inspiration for the panel. And yeah, she's doing a lot of the behind the scenes work for this. So thank you, Rachel.
Super thankful.
And yeah, if you're interested in learning more about history of either of our movements, we had a lot of research that we didn't have time to present about because we wanted to prioritize having our panelists on. So we may do this again. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I'd be happy to come back, and I would definitely recommend everyone read Howard Zinn's People's History of the U.S. as a good starting point. It's
Yes, thank you for the plug.
I mean, I got a whole bunch more back here, but that's a good place to start.
Awesome. Well, thanks to our panelists, and thanks to everyone for joining us, and hope everyone enjoys the rally.
Thank you, guys.